You're the kind of guy women remember fondly, not the kind they stay with, my girlfriend said during a rainy walk home after dinner. I quietly opened my umbrella, walked her home, and left forever. Months later, she sent a long apology after seeing my wedding invitation shared online. Rain hit the umbrella I hadn't opened yet, and Qley said it like she was reading off a grocery list. You're the kind of guy women remember fondly, not the kind they stay with. I froze on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, water already finding the collar of my jacket. Cars hissed past on wet asphalt. Somewhere behind us, the valet was calling out a ticket number to nobody in particular. I waited for the rest of it. The justification. I just mean, that usually softens a sentence like that. It didn't come. She just stood there, hands in her coat pockets, looking at me with an expression that wasn't cruel. That was the part that got me. It wasn't cruel. It was certain. 2 years. 2 years of Sunday grocery runs and her sister's birthday dinners, and the apartment we'd started half furnishing together, like a sentence we both assumed would finish itself. 2 years, and she'd just told me, calmly, in the rain, that I was a chapter and not a book. I didn't say anything for a second. I felt the words land somewhere behind my sternum and just sit there, heavy and quiet, the way a verdict sits in a courtroom before anyone reacts to it. Then I opened the umbrella. I held it over her head, not mine. Habit, maybe. Or just the last functioning piece of a version of me that hadn't caught up yet to what had just happened. We walked. I didn't ask her to explain. She didn't offer to. The 6 blocks to her building passed in a silence that somehow felt louder than anything either of us could have said. I didn't know it then, but somewhere months down the line, that same woman would sit at her kitchen table and write me a message she never expected to send. The kind of message people write when the version of events they'd settled on stops holding together. That night, though, I just walked her home in the rain and said nothing. To understand the rain, you have to understand the 2 years before it, because I didn't see it coming, and I think that matters. I wasn't a man who'd been warned and ignored it. I was a man standing on what I genuinely believed was solid ground. We'd met at a mutual friend's birthday, Navy, actually, who's still in my life now in a way that says more about him than about either of the people he introduced. Qley had this laugh that arrived a half second before the joke landed, like she was already anticipating being delighted. I liked that about her immediately. I liked a lot about her immediately. The first year was easy in the way good things are supposed to be easy. We built routines without trying to. Sunday mornings became a diner 3 blocks from her place, the one with the bottomless coffee and a waitress named Lauren who started bringing Qley's order before she asked. We talked about an apartment together before we'd even said the word serious out loud, like the future was just a logical extension of the present, no negotiation required. My best friend Knox liked her. That mattered to me more than I probably admitted at the time. Knox doesn't perform approval. If he doesn't like someone, you know within the hour. He liked Qley. He told me once, over beers, that she made me less in my own head, which from Knox was practically a toast. I had a good job, the kind that was turning into a good career. My mentor at the firm, Cash, used to tell me I had a slow build, which he meant as a compliment. The kind of person who doesn't flash early but ends up somewhere real. I believed him. I believed in the slow build of everything. The relationship, the career, the life I assumed Qley and I were quietly constructing together, one Sunday at a time. Looking back, there were things I should have clocked. Small things. The way Qley had started describing her co-workers' relationships with a kind of wistfulness that didn't quite fit. He just showed up at her office with flowers, no reason, just because, said with an emphasis that, in hindsight, wasn't really about the co-worker at all. The way she'd started following more accounts that posted grand gesture compilations, engagement videos with fireworks, men quitting jobs to chase her around the world. I didn't think much of it. People watch things online. It didn't occur to me it was a wish list. I didn't realize it then, sitting across from her at dinner 2 years deep, a pause. I stood frozen in the hallway, keys still in my hand. It's not about good. Good isn't the same as unforgettable, you know? I don't know if I want safe. I think I want to feel like someone's whole world got rearranged because of me. I didn't hear the rest. I made noise on purpose, dropped my keys, cleared my throat, and walked in like I'd just arrived. She startled, hung up fast, smiled at me like nothing had happened. I didn't confront her. I told myself it was an out-of-context fragment, that people say dramatic things to their best friends that don't reflect anything real. I told myself a version of the story where that conversation meant nothing. But it sat in me. A splinter I kept telling myself wasn't there. It took the full unraveling. Weeks of it, conversations strung together after the fact, for me to understand what Qley actually meant, and I want to be fair to her here, because I don't think she was lying when she said I was a good partner. I think she believed that completely. That was almost the worst part. Qley didn't think I'd failed her. She thought I'd never been capable of the things she actually wanted, and no amount of effort on my part was going to manufacture it, because it wasn't a behavior. It was a category. She wanted to be swept somewhere. Not metaphorically, literally swept, narratively, the way people get swept in the videos she'd been quietly absorbing for months. She wanted a love that announced itself, that interrupted her day, that made other people say wow when they heard about it. She'd grown up, she told me once during one of our last real conversations, watching her parents have a marriage that looked, from the outside, like a long administrative arrangement, coexistence without combustion. She'd promised herself she wouldn't end up there. And somewhere along the way, in the slow, comfortable build of our 2 years, she'd started to believe she was watching that promise break in real time. I want to be honest. I don't think she was wrong to want intensity. I think she was wrong about what intensity actually sustains. But I didn't know how to say that to her in a way that didn't sound like I was just defending my own shortcomings. So for a long time, I said nothing at all. There was one conversation, about 10 days before the rain, that cracked the whole thing open, though I didn't fully understand it until much later. We were lying in bed, not touching, which had become more common than either of us acknowledged. She said, out of nowhere, "Do you ever think we're just comfortable? Like, is that all this is?" I said comfortable wasn't a bad thing. I said I'd built my whole life around the idea that comfortable, real, chosen love was the rare thing, that intensity was cheap, that anyone could manufacture a grand gesture, but showing up every single unremarkable day was the actual hard part, the actual rare part. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "So when we stood outside the restaurant in the rain, and she said the sentence about women remembering me fondly, I understood, in the space of about 4 seconds, that I wasn't hearing a new thought. I was hearing the conclusion of a trial that had been quietly running for months, when I hadn't even known I was a defendant in." I opened the umbrella. I held it over her, not me, because some habits don't ask your permission before they activate. We started walking. "You don't have anything to say?" she asked, after the first block. "What is there to say?" I said, "Not angry, just tired. In the specific way you're tired when you realize you've been fighting for something that was already over. You've clearly already decided what I am. I don't think I can argue you out of a conclusion you've been building for months." She looked at me, surprised, like she'd expected pushback, maybe even wanted it. "I didn't say this to hurt you." "I know," I said, and I meant it. That was the strange mercy of the whole thing. I didn't think she was being cruel. I think she genuinely believed she was being honest, that honesty was a kindness, that telling me the truth about how she saw me was somehow better than letting me keep believing in a future she no longer wanted. We walked the rest of the way mostly in silence. She tried, once, around the 4th block, to explain further, something about how she cared about me, how this wasn't about anything I'd done wrong, how she just didn't think she could keep pretending the comfortable thing was enough for her. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself, because somewhere in that block I'd already started understanding that defense wasn't going to be useful here. You can't argue someone out of what they want. You can only let them want it somewhere else. We reached her building. The rain had softened to a mist by then, the kind that doesn't really fall so much as hang in the air. "I'm sorry," she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the second word, the first real crack in her composure all night. "I don't want you to think this was easy." "I don't think anything yet," I said. "I think I need to not be standing in the rain with you right now." She nodded. She didn't ask me to come up, and I didn't expect her to. I waited until she'd gotten her key in the door, until the lobby light caught her for a second before the door swung shut behind her, and then I turned and walked back into the rain alone. I didn't go back to my apartment, not right away. I walked 40 minutes, maybe longer, through streets I didn't track, past restaurants closing up, past a couple arguing quietly under an awning, past my own reflection in storefront windows that I avoided looking at directly. I wasn't thinking in sentences. I was just moving. The way you move when stillness feels like it would let something catch up to you that you're not ready to feel yet. By the time I got home, soaked through, I'd made a decision I didn't fully articulate to myself until the next morning. I wasn't going to fight for this. Not because I didn't love her. I did, stupidly, completely, in the unglamorous way that doesn't make for a good highlight reel, but because you can't build a future with someone whose entire framework has already filed you under not enough, not as an insult, but as a settled fact. That was the last night Qley and I spent in any real sense together. We exchanged the apartment logistics over the following 2 weeks, practical, clipped, the kind of conversations that happen between people removing themselves from each other's lives one shared object at a time. I took my name off the lease. She kept the apartment. I moved into a place above a hardware store that smelled like sawdust for the first month, and I didn't look back, not because it didn't hurt, but because looking back wasn't going to change anything she'd already decided about who I was. The first few weeks alone were rough in a way I don't think I fully admitted to anyone, including Knox, including myself. I went to work, did the job, came home to an apartment that didn't have her things scattered through it, and somehow felt louder for the absence rather than quieter. But something shifted, slowly, in a way I can only really see in hindsight. I stopped trying to figure out what I'd done wrong, because I'd come to understand, really understand, not just intellectually accept, that the problem hadn't been a doing problem. It had been a believing problem, hers, not mine. I couldn't have fixed it by being better, because it wasn't asking for better. It was asking for different, and I wasn't going to contort myself into someone I wasn't in order to satisfy a vision of love I didn't actually believe in. So I did something simpler. I focused on my own life. Cash, my mentor, became a bigger presence during that stretch, mostly by accident. We started getting lunch more regularly, and he had this way of asking questions that made you actually examine your own answers instead of just performing them. "What do you actually want out of the next 5 years?" he asked me once, over sandwiches. Not "what do you want to prove to someone who isn't in the room anymore?" I didn't have a good answer the first time he asked. By the third or fourth lunch, I did. I started running again, something I'd let slide during the relationship without really noticing. Not dramatically, just 3 mornings a week, then 4, until it became a piece of architecture in my day I didn't question anymore. I picked up a coding course I'd been meaning to start for 2 years, the kind of thing that had always existed on a someday list that never quite became a today list. I finished it in 4 months. Work noticed before I did, honestly. Cash put me on a project that had real visibility, the kind of assignment that either makes you or quietly reveals you weren't ready. I was ready. I didn't know I was ready until I was already 3 weeks into doing well at it. Hazel, a coworker who'd always been more acquaintance than friend, became something closer to a real friend during that stretch. She had this dry, unimpressed way of cutting through self-pity that I needed more than I wanted to admit. When I mentioned Qley once, early on, fishing a little for sympathy, Hazel just said, "Sounds like she wanted a movie and you were busy building an actual life." Those aren't the same thing, and only one of them is real. I didn't fully believe her in the moment. I believe her now. I heard about Qley occasionally, the way you do in a city with overlapping social circles. Navy mentioned her in passing. Knox got a stray update from someone. She was apparently seeing someone a few months after we split, a guy who, from what I gathered, specialized in exactly the kind of gesture she'd been describing all those months: surprise trips, public declarations, the visible architecture of romance. I felt something when I heard that. Not heartbreak, not anymore, by then. Something closer to a quiet, sad clarity. There it is. That's what she was waiting for. I hoped it made her happy. I genuinely did. I just knew, with a certainty I couldn't fully explain, that it wasn't going to be the thing she actually needed. I wasn't thinking about dating again. Not really, not for a long while. I wasn't avoiding it on purpose. I just wasn't looking. I was busy becoming someone I actually recognized again. I met Ren at, of all places, a hardware store. The one beneath my apartment. Actually, on a Saturday morning when I was buying paint for a wall I decided needed a different color than the one Qley and I had picked together 18 months earlier. Small detail, but it mattered to me at the time, repainting that wall. It felt like an actual ending, more than the lease paperwork had. Ren was standing in the same aisle, comparing 2 shades of off-white with the kind of focused seriousness usually reserved for much bigger decisions. "Do you have an opinion?" she asked, not even looking up, "on whether oat milk is meaningfully different from soft linen?" I told her honestly that I did not, but that I'd recently made the mistake of choosing a wall color based on someone else's taste and was now repainting it. So maybe she shouldn't take my opinion anyway. She laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and said that was either the most depressing or most useful thing anyone had said to her in the paint aisle. We talked for 20 minutes longer than either of us had budgeted for. She worked as a structural engineer, which she mentioned almost apologetically, like she expected it to kill the conversation. It didn't. I asked actual questions. She seemed surprised that I did. I didn't get her number that day. I want to be honest about that, because it matters to how the rest of this went. I wasn't operating from a rebound playbook, grabbing at the first available warmth. I left the hardware store with my paint and no plan, and it was a full week later, running into her again at the same store, buying, this time, a hook for a coat closet, that I actually asked if she wanted to get coffee sometime. Not dinner. Coffee. Low stakes, low ceremony. That was, I think now, the first real difference between this and what came before. Qley and I had moved fast because moving fast felt like proof of something. With Ren, I didn't feel the need to prove anything. I just wanted to know her, at whatever speed that actually took. The first few months were unhurried in a way that, honestly, unsettled me a little at first, because I'd internalized somewhere that unhurried meant uninterested. It didn't. Ren was just someone who didn't perform enthusiasm she didn't feel, and didn't withhold it either. When she liked something, she said so, plainly. When she didn't, she said that too. There was no guessing required, no decoding of subtext, no audit of her affection to figure out if it had quietly diminished while I wasn't looking. We didn't do grand gestures. I want to be honest about that too, because I think it matters to the shape of this story. There was no surprise flight to Charleston. There was a Tuesday where she showed up at my apartment with soup because I'd mentioned, almost in passing, that I had a cold, and she'd remembered, 3 days later, a detail I hadn't expected anyone to hold on to. There was a night she sat with me for 2 hours while I talked through a work problem that wasn't actually about work, not really, and she didn't try to fix it, she just stayed present in it with me. I told her about Qley, eventually, a few months in. Not in a dramatic confession kind of way. Just honestly, the way you tell someone about a part of your history that shaped you. I told her what Qley had said in the rain. Ren was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I still think about. That's such a strange thing to want from someone. To be remembered fondly instead of chosen. Those aren't even on the same scale. I hadn't thought about it that way before, not explicitly, but she was right. Qley had wanted me to be unforgettable. Ren just wanted me to be known. Those turned out to be very different ambitions, and only one of them, it turned out, was something a real relationship could actually be built on. What grew between Ren and me didn't announce itself the way I'd once believed love was supposed to. It accumulated. Trust accumulated the way good things often do, through unremarkable repetition, through 100 small moments where she could have let me down and didn't, where I could have let her down and didn't, until eventually neither of us was waiting for the other shoe anymore, because there was no longer any reasonable expectation of a shoe. She met Knox about 4 months in, and his reaction was the same low-key, unmistakable approval he'd shown for Qley once, except this time it came with something extra, a kind of relief, almost, that I didn't fully register until later. She actually listens when you talk, he told me afterward, like that was the whole review. From Knox, it basically was. Cash met her once at a work function and said, with the dry understatement he applies to everything, that one's not auditioning for anything. That's rare. I didn't fully understand what he meant until much later, but I think he meant that Ren wasn't performing a version of herself calibrated to impress, the way some people do in new relationships. She was just being herself, consistently, and trusting that to be enough. Which, it turned out, it was. What struck me most, the thing I hadn't realized I'd been missing until I had it, was the experience of being appreciated for who I already was, rather than who I might become under sufficient pressure or persuasion. Ren never once suggested I needed to be more dramatic, more spontaneous, more unforgettable. She liked the version of me that showed up reliably, that remembered things, that built a life methodically instead of performing one cinematically. For the first time in longer than I wanted to admit, I wasn't being measured against a standard I hadn't agreed to. We moved in together about 1.5 years in, slower than Qley and I had, deliberately so, both of us having learned something from speed that hadn't served us the first time around. The apartment felt different from the start, not because the furniture was nicer, but because nothing in it felt provisional. Nothing felt like it was waiting to be approved. Meanwhile, in the loose, overlapping way that social circles never quite let people disappear from each other's lives entirely, word of all this drifted back toward Qley. Navy mentioned, at some gathering, that I seemed happy. Ember, of all people, ran into Hazel at some unrelated event and reported back that I'd really gotten his life together. a phrase that apparently irritated Qley more than she expected it to when Ember relayed it. At first, I'm told, she brushed it off. People move on, she reportedly said. That's normal. But the updates kept arriving, the way they do in a city that's smaller than it looks, and something in her seemed to shift from disinterest to a low, persistent unease she couldn't quite name, at least not yet. Something was building, off in the periphery of my life, that I wasn't paying attention to, because I wasn't thinking about Qley anymore, not really. I was thinking about Ren, about the life we were building, about a future that for the first time in years didn't feel like it needed defending. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. I proposed to Ren on an ordinary Thursday, which I think tells you everything about what we built. Not a campaign, not a production, a quiet dinner at home, a question asked plainly, an answer given just as plainly. She said yes before I'd even fully finished the sentence, which became a joke between us for months afterward. We didn't rush the wedding planning, but we also didn't drag it out performing some kind of extended courtship for an audience. We picked a date about 10 months out, a small venue upstate that Ren had found, all exposed beams and good light, the kind of place that didn't need much decoration to look like it meant something. Friends got involved the way friends do. Knox, predictably, appointed himself best man before I'd technically asked him, which was fine, because I was going to ask him anyway. Hazel helped Ren with some of the planning logistics, and the two of them got along immediately, in the specific way two no-nonsense people recognize each other across a room. The invitations went out in stages, physical ones to family and close friends, and at some point, because that's just how things work now, someone posted about it. I think it was actually Ember, oddly enough, tagging a mutual friend's engagement party where our save the date had been visible on a side table, the photo catching just enough of it. Ren's name. The date, a soft, candid shot of the two of us that Hazel had taken at the engagement dinner. It wasn't a calculated reveal. Nobody orchestrated it to reach Qley. It just existed online the way things do now, available to anyone who happened to scroll past it, which, eventually, she did. I wasn't there for it, obviously. I only learned about her reaction the way you learn about most things that happen outside your direct view. Secondhand, pieced together later from people who'd been closer to it. From what I understand, she saw the post on a Tuesday evening. She didn't comment. She didn't like it. According to Ember, who told this to Hazel, who eventually told me, Qley just sat with her phone for a long time, scrolling back through the photo, the comments, friends celebrating, people she still knew tagging each other, the easy warmth of a crowd that had simply absorbed the news and moved forward with it, the way crowds do. I think what got to her, more than the fact of the wedding itself, was the normalcy of it. There was no scandal in the comments, no whisper of, didn't he just go through a breakup? No asterisk on the happiness being expressed. People weren't celebrating a rebound or a hasty decision. They were celebrating something that, from the outside at least, looked solid. Looked, in fact, like exactly the kind of stable, chosen love I'd always believed in and she'd once dismissed as merely comfortable. I think that was the moment something genuinely cracked open for her. Not jealousy exactly, or not only that, but a recalibration she hadn't seen coming. She'd built a story, somewhere in the months and years since the rain, where I was the guy who'd been a fine chapter, not a whole book, someone women remembered fondly but didn't choose. And here was evidence, public, undeniable, scrolling past her on a Tuesday night, that someone had chosen me. Not despite who I was. Because of it. It was about 2 weeks after the engagement post that the message arrived. I almost didn't open it right away. Her name appeared on my phone, and something in me hesitated, an old instinct from a version of myself I'd mostly outgrown, but hadn't entirely shed. Ren was beside me on the couch when it came in. I told her who it was from. She just said, "You can read it. I trust you," and went back to her book, which, in its own quiet way, told me everything about how far I'd actually come from needing anyone's reassurance on this front. The message was long, longer than I expected. I'll give the shape of it rather than every word, because some things deserve paraphrase rather than replay. She started by congratulating me, genuinely. She said, not as a formality. Then she said she'd been thinking about that night in the rain for a long time. Longer, she admitted, than she'd been willing to acknowledge to herself. She said she'd built an idea of love that was really an idea about being seen by other people, about being the subject of a story worth telling at parties, and that somewhere along the way she'd confused that performance for the actual substance of what love was supposed to be. She said she'd dated the kind of man she thought she wanted after we split. The gestures, the spontaneity, the version of romance she'd been quietly auditioning me against for the better part of our relationship. And it hadn't worked, not really. It had been exciting in flashes and exhausting in the long stretches between them. And somewhere around month 4 of that relationship she'd realized, with a kind of dread she said she still remembered clearly, that excitement and security were not the same currency, and she'd spent 2 years demanding I pay her in a currency I'd never actually claimed to deal in. She said she'd misunderstood me, not misjudged my character. She was careful with that distinction, and I appreciated the precision of it, but misjudged what kind of love I was capable of giving, and worse, misjudged what kind of love would have actually been good for her. She said watching the engagement post, watching people she knew celebrate something that looked steady and real, had forced her to admit something she'd been avoiding, that she hadn't left me because I was lacking. She'd left because she hadn't yet learned to recognize the thing I was offering as valuable, because nobody had ever told her that comfortable and safe and reliable were not consolation prizes. They were the actual destination. Everything else was just scenery on the way there, or a way to avoid arriving at all. She ended by saying she didn't expect anything from the message. She just felt she owed me the truth. Finally, the version of it she hadn't been capable of seeing back when it would have mattered more. I read the whole thing twice. Ren glanced over once, not nosy, just present, and asked if I was okay. I told her I was. I meant it. Here's the strange thing about reading an apology you once would have given almost anything to receive. By the time it actually arrives, it doesn't carry the weight you imagined it would. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel the urge to write back something pointed, something that would let her know exactly how much that rainy walk had cost me in the months that followed. I just felt a kind of settled quiet, the feeling of a door that had already closed clicking shut a second time, gently, with no draft coming through it anymore. I wrote back, eventually, a short message. I thanked her for the honesty. I told her I hoped she found whatever she was actually looking for, the real version of it, not the performed one. I told her I wished her well, and I meant that too, fully, without any asterisk attached to it. I didn't tell her that her apology had changed anything, because it hadn't. Not because it wasn't sincere, I believed it was, but because the thing she was apologizing for had already healed over, on its own timeline, built out of running shoes and finished courses and quiet Tuesday soup deliveries, and a wall repainted a color I'd actually chosen myself. Her words couldn't undo the rain, and they didn't need to, because I'd already walked all the way through it, out the other side, into a life that didn't require her revision of it to feel whole. Ren and I got married that following spring, in the upstate venue with the good light, exactly the way we'd planned it, without spectacle, without performance, full of the kind of unremarkable, accumulated love that I'd believed in all along, even when I was the only one in the room who did. Knox gave a best man speech that somehow made everyone laugh and cry within the same sentence. Hazel cried more than she'd ever admit to. Cash, near the end of the night, pulled me aside and said, simply, "Told you." Slow build. I laughed, because he had, in a way, years earlier, before I even knew what I was building toward. I think about that rainy night sometimes, not with bitterness, but the way you think about weather from a trip you took a long time ago, present in the memory, but no longer something that touches you directly. Qley wasn't wrong that I wasn't the kind of man who manufactures unforgettable moments on command. She was wrong about what that meant. I was never the guy women remembered fondly because I wasn't enough to stay with. I was just waiting for someone who understood that staying was the unforgettable part. The man she thought women only remembered became the man another woman chose forever.